The winter of 1879 nearly killed my father 3 times. The first time was the cold. The second time was the town. The third time was his own doubt. He survived all 3. But not because he was the strongest man in Briar Hollow Basin, not because he was the loudest or the most certain or the one with the most firewood stacked against his walls. He survived because he was the most patient, and because he understood something about wind and snow that no one else in that basin had ever stopped long enough to learn. My name is Cobb Voss. I was 9 years old that winter, and this is the story of what my father built and what the storm built for him. September came to Briar Hollow Basin the way it always did in Dakota Territory. Not gently, not with any kindness, but with a particular kind of cold light that made everything look sharper than it was. The grass had already gone the color of old rope. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of our claim had dropped to a thin silver thread, and at night you could hear the first ice forming along its edges, a soft crackling sound like paper being slowly folded in the dark. Every homesteader in the basin knew what that sound meant. Winter was not coming. Winter was already here, standing just beyond the ridgeline, deciding how hard it meant to hit. The sensible men, and there were many of them in Briar Hollow, men who had survived 3 and 4 and 5 Dakota winters, were doing what sensible men did. They were splitting firewood, stacking it shoulder high against the south walls of their cabins. They were sodding gaps in their walls, plugging holes with packed mud and straw, hanging heavy canvas over windows that leaked wind. They were raising plank snow fences on the northern exposure of their properties, long straight walls of rough timber designed to catch the drift before it reached the barn door. These were things that worked. Things that had always worked. Things that every man in that basin had learned from the man before him, passed down like good tools, passed from father to son. My father was doing none of those things. What he was doing from first light to last light, day after day, in that already hardening September earth, was digging holes. Small holes precisely spaced, each one measured twice before the shovel broke ground. And into each hole he was setting a young tree cedar, mostly with lodgepole pine, in the outer positions, pressing frozen dirt around the roots, with his hands moving to the next position, measuring again, digging again. He worked in slow, deliberate circles around our small cabin. Not one circle. 3, each at a different distance from the walls, each with a different spacing between the trees. From a distance, if you didn't know better, it looked like the work of a man who had lost something in the grass and was searching for it in expanding rings. Travelers on the basin road would slow their wagons to watch. Some shook their heads and kept moving. Others stopped long enough to call out something they thought was funny. The children of Briar Hollow had already given my father a name. They called him the Tree Man, in the tone children use when they mean something unkind. My mother stood on the porch and watched him work. She stood there most mornings with one hand resting low against the child growing inside her, 7 months along by then, moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has learned not to trust her own balance. She didn't call out to him. She didn't tell him to stop. She just watched her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her eyes steady and unreadable, in the way that only comes from years of deciding which fears are worth voicing and which ones you carry alone. Her name was Netta. She was 33 years old. She had come to Dakota Territory from western Pennsylvania, 6 years earlier. Following my father west, the way women of that generation followed their husbands. Not blindly, but deliberately. Eyes open, making a calculation about what kind of life was possible and choosing the harder version of it because the harder version was at least honest about what it asked of you. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was a woman who remembered. In the winter of 1874, 5 years before the one this story is about, Netta Voss had lost a child. Not to illness, not to any cause that had a name you could write in a ledger. She lost that child to winter itself, to a season that had come harder and longer than anyone expected, that had eaten through their firewood in the first 6 weeks and left them burning furniture by February, that had buried the trail to town under 4 feet of packed drift for 11 straight days. There was no doctor. There was no neighbor close enough to reach. There was only the cold in the dark and the particular silence of a cabin cut off from the rest of the world by something vast and indifferent and entirely without mercy. She did not speak of it often, but she remembered it with her whole body, the way certain kinds of grief settle into the bones and stay there patient as stones. Now she was 7 months along again. The nearest doctor was 22 miles of mud road and creek crossings away, and her husband was planting trees. She watched him work, and she said nothing, but she had already done something she had not told him about. Beside their bed, tucked against the wall where the floor was flattest, she had placed a small wooden box. Inside it were things she had gathered quietly over the previous 2 weeks. Strips of clean linen cloth, a pair of small scissors with blunt tips, a length of waxed thread, a glass bottle of spirits. She had packed it the way a woman packs something she hopes she will never need, carefully and completely, leaving nothing out. She had not shown it to my father. She had not mentioned it. She simply placed it there against the wall where she could reach it in the dark. And against the wall on the opposite side of the room she had also been watching the old pine dresser. The wide, shallow drawer at the bottom of it, the one they had always used for storing extra blankets. She had not said anything about that either, but I had seen her look at it in the particular way she looked at things she was measuring for a purpose she had not announced. I was 9 years old, and I noticed these things, and I did not ask about them. There are things a child understands without being told. My father's name was Reuben Voss. He was 38 years old that September, though he looked older in the way that men look older when they have spent years working outside, not worn out exactly, but weathered like wood that has been in the weather long enough to show the grain. He was not the kind of man whose presence announced itself before he spoke. He was the kind of man you might pass on a street in Bismarck without looking twice, unremarkable in his canvas coat and his plain hat, carrying nothing about him that announced itself. What he carried was inside. He had spent 3 years in the late 1860s working as a survey assistant in Idaho Territory, moving through country that most men only saw in nightmares. High passes, unmarked ridgelines, river valleys so remote that the survey team went weeks without seeing another human face. In that work, he had learned to read land the way other men read print. Slope and exposure, drainage and prevailing wind, the way snow moved across a hillside where it piled and where it scoured which faces collected ice and which ones shed it. He had learned that land had a logic, and that the logic was there to be read if you were willing to slow down and pay attention to it. In the winter of 1871, he had watched a logging camp get erased. It happened in 2 nights. A storm came down out of the northern ranges with a force that none of the men in camp had seen before, and the plank windbreaks they had built solid walls of thick timber constructed by experienced men who had survived many winters shattered in the first night like kindling. By the second morning, drifts had buried the supply wagons to their roof lines. 3 men spent 4 hours digging out a mule that had been standing in the open. The camp cook lost 2 fingers to frostbite because his gloves were in a crate buried under 6 feet of compacted snow. Reuben survived that storm in a canvas tent that should not have survived anything. He survived because the tent happened to be pitched in the lee of a dense stand of young pine, not by design, but by accident, because the ground there had been level and the stakes had gone in easily. The trees were not large, they were not impressive, but the storm moved differently around them, broken into smaller currents that lost their coherence before they reached him. When the storm passed, he walked uphill through the wreckage of the camp and found 300 yards from where the last windbreak had stood an old trapper's shack that hadn't lost a single shingle. It was surrounded by a crooked, irregular stand of young pine. The trees were not arranged in any pattern that looked intentional. They were just there, growing the way trees grow in protected ground, in a spacing and a density that happened by chance to defeat the storm. The old man who lived there had not built that arrangement. He had simply lived in it for 20 years and noticed what it did. He had a habit of sketching things not artfully, just functionally, the way a man records something he wants to remember. He handed Reuben a page torn from a worn notebook without ceremony. A rough pencil drawing of the shack with circles and arcs around it, distances noted in the margins in a spidery hand. Not a plan. An observation. This is what the trees do. This is where the snow goes. The old man died the following spring. Reuben had kept that page for 8 years. He had kept it folded inside his own survey notebook, tucked between pages of elevation readings and drainage calculations, carried through 3 territories and 4 homestead claims and 1 Dakota winter that had been bad, but not bad enough to test the idea he had been turning over in his mind for nearly a decade. Briar Hollow Basin was the 5th claim. He had chosen it partly for the land, partly for the creek, and partly for something he had recognized the first time he rode through it in the spring of 1878, the way the basin cupped the northern wind, the way the prevailing current came down off the ridge to the north in a long, clean, unbroken flow. The government surveyor had written in his assessment good agricultural land and a winter wind exposure that requires careful preparation. Reuben had read that assessment and understood it differently than the surveyor intended. He had understood it as an invitation. This was not an experiment he hoped might work someday. This was a dead man's knowledge meeting the right piece of ground after 8 years of waiting. Now he was planting his answer to it. The morning Harlan Creed stopped at the Voss claim, the temperature had already dropped below freezing at dawn and stayed there. Creed was 61 years old, a former Union cavalry sergeant who had settled in Dakota Territory in 1869 after deciding that Ohio held nothing he needed anymore. He had survived 7 Dakota winters by the time he pulled his wagon to a stop on the Basin Road and looked at what my father was doing. Creed was not a man who wasted words. He climbed down from the wagon without hurrying, walked to the fence line and stood there for a long moment with his arms resting on the top rail and his eyes moving slowly across the rings of young saplings surrounding our cabin. He didn't laugh. He was past the age of laughing at things he didn't understand. But his expression carried something that was in its own way more difficult to receive than laughter. It was the expression of a man who has seen enough hard winters to recognize a bad idea when it is still young enough to be stopped. My father kept working. He knew Creed was there. He acknowledged him with a nod and went back to his measuring. Creed watched for a while. Then he said, "You know what drift snow does to a house?" It was not a question. My father set down his shovel and came to the fence. He waited. Creed looked out toward the northern ridge. He seemed to be looking at something that wasn't there anymore, some other winter in some other place. "My brother," he said, 1868. He built his place too close to a snow pocket up near Yankton. Storm came through, ran 3 nights straight. Drift climbed over his roof, covered the chimney." He paused. "They found him in the spring, sitting against the wall with a shovel in his hands. The wind moved through the cedar saplings with a thin, dry sound. Creed pointed at the rings surrounding our cabin. "Snow near a house isn't shelter," he said quietly. "It's a grave waiting to happen. You're planting guide wires to show the storm exactly where to bury your family." My father listened to all of this without interrupting. When Creed finished, he said simply, "It won't drift against the walls." Creed looked at him for a moment. "What makes you certain of that?" My father didn't answer right away. He looked at the rings of young trees, at the spacing he had measured so carefully, at the gaps he had left between them that were to an outside eye exactly as confusing as the trees themselves. Then he said, "The gaps are as important as the trees." Creed shook his head slowly. "Those saplings won't last the first real blow." He climbed back onto his wagon. He picked up the reins. Before he moved on, he looked back once at my father standing at the fence line in his canvas coat in the cold morning light, surrounded by his circles of small trees. "I've seen men do foolish things out here," Creed said. "Most of the time, the land just takes them, and that's the end of it. But you've got a wife near her time and a boy to think about." He paused. "Think about them." He drove on. My father stood at the fence for a moment after the wagon had gone. Then he went back to measuring. I watched all of this from the woodpile, where I was supposed to be stacking split pine. I had stopped stacking some time before. I was watching my father's face while Harlan Creed talked, and what I saw there was not what I expected. I expected to see stubbornness or bite or the particular expression adults get when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the other person to finish speaking. What I saw instead was something quieter. Something that looked, if anything, like a man paying careful attention, like a man storing information he intended to use. That evening, Edith Creed came to see my mother. She came in the late afternoon when the light was already going orange and thin across the basin, driving their second wagon with a jar of preserved plums in her lap, and the careful expression of a woman who has been asked to carry a message she did not entirely write herself. She was a solid, plain-spoken woman in her mid-50s, not unkind, not cruel, but possessed of the frontier conviction that sentiment was a luxury and practicality was a virtue, and that a woman who confused the two would eventually pay for the confusion in ways that were very hard and very specific. She and my mother sat at the kitchen table with cups of weak tea. I sat in the corner pretending to mend a harness buckle. Neither of them told me to leave, which meant they both knew I was listening and had decided it was acceptable. Edith said what she had come to say without much preamble. The women in the basin were worried. Not about Reuben specifically, about Netta, about the baby, about the fact that the cabin's woodpile was smaller than it should be for this point in the season, and the firewood money had apparently been spent on cedar saplings and measuring rope. Fancy ideas don't keep babies warm, Edith said. She said it gently, which made it harder rather than easier to hear. More wood does, a proper snow fence does, things that have worked before. My mother wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at Edith with a steadiness that I recognized. It was the steadiness she used when she had already thought about something longer and harder than the person she was talking to had, and had nothing left to argue because the argument was already over inside her own mind. "I know what keeps a baby warm," my mother said. "I know what doesn't, too." Edith heard something in those words that went beyond their surface. She looked at my mother for a moment with an expression that softened into something that was less about advice and more about the plain recognition of one woman's fear by another. She didn't ask what Netta meant. Some things between women who have lived on the frontier long enough do not need to be spelled out. Edith left the preserved plums and drove home in the failing light. My mother sat at the table for a long time after the wagon sounds had faded. She didn't move to clear the teacups. She sat with her hands folded and looked at the far wall. And I stayed very quiet in my corner because I understood in the way children understand these things that she was somewhere I could not follow. After a while, she got up and began making supper. She moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has made supper in small spaces for a long time, and she didn't say anything, and I didn't ask. But that night after supper was cleared and my father had come in from his work and washed the dirt from his hands at the basin by the door, my mother said something to him that she had not said before in the entire 2 months he had been planning and planting his rings of trees. She said it quietly after I was supposed to be asleep. But the cabin was small and the walls were thin, and I heard every word. She said, "I'm not afraid you're wrong, Reuben." My father waited. "I'm afraid you're right," she said, "but right too late." There was a long silence. I heard the fire settle in the stove. Then my mother said, "Come here." I heard movement, a pause. Then my father's voice very low. "How long have you had this?" 2 weeks. My mother said. Another silence. Longer this time. I knew without seeing it that she had shown him the box beside the bed. The box with the linen strips and the scissors and the waxed thread. The box she had prepared for a birth that might happen when no help was available, when the road was buried and the doctor was 22 miles away. And the storm didn't care about any of that. She had not told him about it. She had not asked his permission or his opinion. She had simply done what needed to be done, and placed it where she could reach it in the dark. I heard my father move. A pause. Then a longer silence than any that had preceded it, the silence of a man looking at something that reorganizes the way he understands his situation. My father had spent 2 months planting trees to protect his family from a storm he could see coming. My mother had spent 2 weeks preparing for a birth she might face alone. They had both been working in parallel in silence toward the same essential truth that the winter of 1879 was going to ask more of this family than any winter had asked before, and that you prepared for that, not by pretending it wasn't coming, but by looking at it directly and making your arrangements accordingly. I don't know everything that passed between them that night. I was 9 years old, and I heard voices and silences and the sound of the fire, and I put together what I could from those things. What I understood was this: something had shifted, something that had been held apart. Two separate people carrying separate fears and separate silences had been placed on the same table. When I looked through the gap in the curtain that separated my sleeping corner from the rest of the cabin, I saw my father sitting at the table with my mother's small wooden box open before him. He was looking at what was inside it with the careful, methodical attention he gave to everything, as he looked at the scissors and the linen cloth and the waxed thread. His eyes moved across the room to the old pine dresser against the wall. They settled on the wide, shallow drawer at the bottom, the one used for extra blankets, and stayed there for a moment before returning to the box. He sat there for a long time. My mother had gone to bed. The fire had burned down to coals. And still he seen the low red light, both hands flat on the table, his face very still. I went to sleep listening to him sit in that silence. And in the morning he was already outside, already working, already moving through the frost-stiffened grass with his measuring rope and his shovel, his breath coming in steady white clouds in the first cold light. November came. With it came the first storm. Not the true blizzard, not the thing that Reuben Voss had been designing against since September, but a precursor, a hard 3-day blow that came down off the northern ridge with enough force to test the ideas of any man who had them. The wind arrived just after midnight on the 1st of November. My father had been sleeping lightly the way he had slept every night for weeks, not truly resting but lying in a half-woken state with some portion of his mind continuously tracking the sounds outside the cabin walls. The change in the wind woke him before the shutters began to rattle. By the time the snow came fast dry, driven sideways across the basin floor, he was already at the north wall listening. At first, in the earliest hours of the storm, he believed the system was performing as intended. The sound of the wind hitting the outer pine line was broken, irregular, a turbulent hiss rather than a clean, sustained roar. Snow was beginning to accumulate, but he could hear from the way it moved that it was collecting at the outer ring rather than against the cabin walls. Then the wind shifted. It was a small shift, not a full directional change, but a westward lean that altered the angle of approach by perhaps 20 degrees. In an open field against a flat wall, that shift would have meant almost nothing. Against his ring system, it meant everything. The westward lean pushed the wind through a section of the outer ring where he had spaced the trees at a slightly more regular interval than he had intended. He had noticed the regularity when he planted it and told himself it was within acceptable tolerance. He had been wrong. The regularity created a smooth channel instead of broken turbulence, not a wall but a funnel. And the wind found it the way water finds a gap in a levee. Not with intelligence, but with the patient, inevitable logic of pressure moving through the path of least resistance. The funneled wind curled backward on the far side of the gap, rebuilt its coherence, and slammed into the east wall of the goat shed with concentrated force. By sunrise, the drift against the shed had climbed to chest height. Two of the young pines in the section with the regular spacing had bent nearly flat under the accumulated snow load. A third had snapped at the trunk. Harlan Creed rode past on the basin road in the gray morning light and stopped when he saw the damage. He looked at the half-buried shed. He looked at the collapsed saplings lying in the drift like broken arrows. He looked at my father, who was standing at the outer ring, already assessing, already working backward from the failure to its cause. Creed said, "Told you. Storm only needs one opening." He rode on. My father did not watch him go. He was already crouching in the snow beside the broken section of the outer ring, pressing his hand against a drift to feel its density, reading the failure, the way he read everything, not with frustration but with attention, looking for the specific information it contained. That night, while my mother and I were inside, he stayed outside alone. He worked until 3 in the morning. He pulled nearly a dozen saplings from the frozen ground, not to discard them, but to reposition them to break the regularity that had created the fatal channel. to introduce the deliberate irregularity that the wind could not funnel through cleanly. He packed frozen dirt around each root ball with his hands when his gloves split at the palms. Blood darkened the fabric around his fingers, and he kept working. The sound of the shovel in frozen ground came through the cabin wall in steady, unhurried strokes. I lay in my sleeping corner listening to it, that rhythm, relentless and calm, neither quickening with urgency nor slowing with discouragement, until sometime before dawn it finally stopped and silence returned, and I drifted into a thin and restless sleep. In the morning I was at the stove when he came inside. He did not look defeated. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had received new information and was in the process of incorporating it. His face carrying the particular focused calm of someone whose problem has just become more specific and therefore more manageable. He washed his hands. The cuts on his palms had dried in the cold. He looked at them for a moment, then sat down at the table. I brought him coffee. We sat together in the early light without talking. Through the window, the basin stretched out under its thin coating of new snow, pale and flat and enormous under a sky the color of iron filings. After a while, I asked him, "Are we going to be okay, Pa?" He looked at me. Not quickly, not with false reassurance, but with the same steady directness. He gave everything that required his attention. "Go keep the fire, Cobb," he said. I went back to the stove. I kept the fire. I thought about what he had not said, and what he had not said told me more than most answers would have. That afternoon, he went back outside. He was there until dark. The second week of November arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift in the sky, no particular morning that announced itself as different from the one before. Just the cold, deepening by another degree, then another. The way debt deepens quietly, incrementally, until one day you look at the number and understand that the situation has changed while you were paying attention to other things. Ruben Voss had been paying attention to one thing with a kind of singular focus that looked from the outside like a man who had lost his sense of proportion. He was out before first light every morning, moving through the frost-stiffened grass, standing at drift patterns left by the November storm, with his hand extended into them, reading their density and depth and angle. He was not checking anymore in the systematic way of the past weeks. He was thinking through the failure, reconstructing it from the evidence the storm had left behind, working backward from effect to cause with the same patience he had once given to reading terrain in the Idaho high country. He was redesigning, not abandoning, not starting over. Redesigning the way an engineer goes back to a bridge that has shown a weakness and looks not at the whole structure but at the specific point of failure, asking what exact force acted on, what exact element, and produced what exact result. The November storm had been a teacher, a harsh one, the kind that doesn't soften its lessons for the sake of your feelings. But a teacher nonetheless, and Ruben Voss was constitutionally incapable of ignoring what his situation was trying to tell him. He spread his survey notebook open on the kitchen table each evening and worked by lantern light, redrawing the ring schematics with the corrections the storm had indicated. The outer pine ring needed adjustment in the western section. The spacing there had to be broken, made deliberately irregular, so that no channel of consistent width could form. He had understood this in theory before the storm. Now he understood it in the particular way you only understand things that have failed on you in the body. In the hands, in the specific memory of standing in the cold at midnight watching where the drift built wrong. The inner cedar ring needed to come tighter in two sections and looser in one. The loose section was intentional. A pressure release, a place where accumulated wind force could bleed outward at an angle away from the cabin rather than compressing and rebounding. He called these the drift lanes in his notebook, marked them in the margins with small arrows indicating direction. They were not weaknesses in the system. They were deliberate exits channels he was offering the storm so it would not have to make its own, the heart of the whole design. The element that made everything else possible was the dead air basin he was trying to create in the space between the two rings and the cabin walls. Not a windless space. The wind would get there eventually. But a space where the wind arrived broken, depleted, stripped of its coherence and momentum, too tired and fragmented to carry serious snow load. A space where if you stood in it during a storm, the air around you would feel different from the air 20 feet away. Not calm, but quieter. The way a river gets quieter in the deep middle even when the banks are turbulent. He explained all of this to me one afternoon while I sat beside him at the table, watching him work the measuring rope around his knee and recalculate a distance on the schematic. I was the first person he explained it to fully. Not my mother, not Harlan Creed, not any of the other homesteaders who had stopped on the Basin Road to observe and offer their opinions. Me, 9 years old, trying to understand a drawing made on old survey paper by a man who thought in three-dimensional wind patterns the way other men thought in words. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. I understood that the gaps between the trees were not mistakes or carelessness. I understood that the wind was not an enemy to be stopped, but a force to be redirected, broken apart, made to spend itself somewhere other than against our walls. I understood that my father was not, as the town believed, a man doing something foolish. He was a man doing something that required a different kind of intelligence than the kind the Basin was accustomed to recognizing. That was the afternoon I stopped being afraid of the winter. Solomon Cade arrived on a Thursday from the north. Most travelers on the Basin Road came from the east from the direction of Calderbrook, 8 miles away. Solomon Cade came from the north, from the direction of the high country where he had spent the better part of 30 years running trap lines through terrain that would have killed an ordinary man by his third winter. He was 67 years old, though he looked both older and younger than that, in different moments older in the deep weathering of his face and hands, younger in the quality of his movement, which was careful and deliberate, and entirely without wasted motion. He did not knock. He tied his mule at the fence post, walked across the frozen yard, and opened the cabin door. My father looked up from the table. Solomon Cade looked at the schematic spread across it. He sat down across from my father without being invited and studied the drawing for a long time without speaking. My father let him look. I stayed in my corner. The old trapper's eyes moved across the paper with the same quality of attention my father gave to drift patterns, not reading it the way you read words, but studying it the way you study terrain, looking for the logic underneath the marks. His expression gave nothing away. Finally, he said, "What's the space between the rings for?" It wasn't entirely a question. My father said, "Dead air. The wind comes in broken from the cedar ring and loses momentum in the open space before it reaches the walls." Cade was quiet. "How broken?" "Broken enough," my father said. "If the ring spacing holds." Another silence. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside the basin, wind moved against the cabin with a low, sustained pressure. Solomon. Cade leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks when he is finding something in his memory. Then he said, 1863. Up in the Bitterroot country north of the Salmon River breaks. He spoke the way old men sometimes speak about things they have thought about for a long time, not hurrying, not dramatizing, just setting the facts out in order the way you set tools on a workbench. I was running a line through a valley that should have been impassable in winter. Usually was. Storm came in the second week of January, a 3-day blow. I found shelter in a low basin maybe 200 yards across, ringed on 3 sides by blow-down trees that had come down in a fire some years before, fallen outward from the center. 3 layers of them irregular, crisscrossed. He paused. My father had put down his pencil. Inside that ring of blowdown, Solomon Cade said, the temperature was noticeably warmer than the open country 20 feet outside it. The wind inside moved differently. You could feel it on your skin, not gone, but tired. Like it had done most of its work getting through the blowdown and didn't have much left when it reached me. He looked at the schematic again. The bear I found in there wasn't in a cave. She was in an open den against the north side of the basin, lying there with her cubs, comfortable as you please. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was as close to wonder as a man like Solomon Cade probably ever got. She didn't fight the mountain. She found the place the mountain forgot to freeze. He looked at my father. My father looked at him. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. Then Solomon Cade stood up, moved to the door and left without another word. He hadn't offered approval. He hadn't said my father was right. He was not the kind of man who handed out conclusions like gifts. But he had walked in, looked at the schematic, and told that story. And in the context of everything that had been said about Reuben Voss and his rings of trees since September, that was as clear a statement as Solomon Cade was capable of making. My father sat at the table after he left and looked at the door for a moment. Then he looked down at his schematic. He picked up his pencil. He made a small correction in the western cedar section that he had been uncertain about for 2 weeks. He made it with confidence. For the first time since September, someone else had looked at what my father was building and seen it not as foolishness, not as eccentricity, but as a thing with logic. A thing with precedent in the way the old country itself worked in blowdowns and ravines and sheltered basins, building its own versions of the same design for as long as the wind had been moving across the high ground. That night, my father slept the first full sleep he had managed in weeks. I know because I was awake enough to notice the difference. The third week of November brought the cold settling into the basin like a tenant who intends to stay. Not the cold of early autumn, which had a quality of temporariness about it. This was the winter cold of Dakota Territory, in its mature and fully committed form, the cold that found the gaps in your thinking, the places where you had told yourself it probably wouldn't get that bad, and installed itself there precisely. Water left in buckets formed a skin of ice before noon. The creek to the east had gone fully silent. The ground had hardened past the point where a shovel made much impression on it, which meant the last repositioning work had to be done by heating the earth with a small fire before attempting to break it. My father worked in this cold every day. He had completed the repositioning of the western outer ring section after the November storm. He had adjusted the cedar choke ring in the 2 sections that needed tightening and opened the drift lane in the section that needed releasing. He had walked the full perimeter of all 3 rings so many times in the past weeks that his own boot prints had worn a visible path in the frost-killed grass around the cabin. Now he was going back over every element of the system with the same careful attention he had given to building it, looking for anything the redesign might have introduced that the original design hadn't contained. One afternoon he called me out from the wood I was stacking. "Come here," he said. I went to him. He was standing with one hand pressed flat against a cedar trunk at the inner ring at a point on the north side where the trees were planted at their tightest spacing. He nodded at the gap between 2 cedars. "Put your hand through," he said, palm facing the wind. I put my hand through beside where his had been. The wind on the outer side of the cedar ring had a clean, direct force to it, a sustained pressure you could lean into slightly. On the sheltered side, where my hand now was, the air moved differently. It came through the cedar branches in small, irregular pulses. The force was still there, but it had lost its shape, its coherent directionality. It moved the way a stream moves after passing through river rocks, still moving, still present, but scattered its energy distributed across too many small currents to carry the weight of one large one. "You feel the difference," my father said. I did. "That's what it does to snow," he said. "Snow needs a coherent current to travel. Break the current, you break the carrying. The snow drops where the current drops." He looked at the ring line and then at the cabin beyond it. "Not against the walls. Out here." He said it the way a man says something he has thought about for 8 years and is still not entirely certain of. Which is to say, with conviction and with the residue of doubt that honest conviction always carries. Harlan Creed came back on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November. He tied his horse at the fence post and walked across the frozen yard without knocking, the way men on the frontier did when the visit was practical rather than social. He found my father at the outer pine ring resetting a stake he had decided was 6 inches too far east. Creed stood and watched him work. My father worked. This went on for some time. The wind moved between them across the frozen grass. In the distance, the sky had accumulated the quality it had been building for days, flat and pale and dense with something that had not yet arrived. Finally, Harlan Creed said, "How wide are the gaps in the inner ring?" My father looked up. He looked at Creed for a moment with the attentiveness of a man who has registered that something has changed in the nature of a conversation. Because this was not the way Harlan Creed had spoken before he had stated conclusions, before he had delivered verdicts. This was a question, a real one, asked by a man who did not yet know the answer and was admitting as much by asking. My father said, 3.5 feet at the tightest points, 7 feet at the drift lanes. Creed nodded slowly. He looked at the cedar ring at the gap between the 2 rings at the dead air basin between them and the cabin walls. He seemed to be measuring it with his eyes. He said, "The gap in the middle, what does that do?" My father said, "The wind comes through the outer ring and drops, comes through the cedar ring and breaks apart. By the time it crosses the middle gap, it doesn't have enough coherence left to carry serious snow load." Creed was quiet for a moment. "In theory," he said. "In theory, my father agreed." Another silence. Creed looked at the repositioned section of the outer ring, the new irregular spacing, no 2 gaps the same width, no 2 trees the same distance from their neighbor. "You changed this after the November blow." The regular spacing was creating a channel. Creed studied the repositioned trees with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand, not someone who has already decided. He did not offer an opinion. He did not say whether the repositioning looked correct to him, but he stood there and looked at it. And a man who comes back to look again has already admitted to himself, if not to anyone else, that his first looking was not sufficient. My father did not make anything of it. He did not press the point or acknowledge the implicit concession. He answered the questions as they were asked, and went back to work when Creed had run out of questions. Creed stood at the fence for a while longer. Then he mounted his horse and rode down the basin road without another word. I watched him go and then looked at my father, who was already 3 stakes along from where the conversation had happened, his attention fully returned to the work. "Pa," I said. He looked at me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. What I was feeling was something that didn't have a clean name at 9 years old. Something like watching a heavy thing begin very slowly to move. "Never mind," I said. My father looked at me a moment longer. Then something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the internal acknowledgement of a thing recognized. He turned back to his measuring rope. That was enough. Meanwhile, in the cabin, my mother moved through her days with the quiet determination of a woman who has made her peace with uncertainty and decided to be useful inside it. The 3rd week of November. Temperature dropping below 0 at night. She had stopped trying to calculate how far along she was in the way that admitted error. She knew the baby was coming, and she knew it was coming before spring, and she knew there was a version of events in which it came when the road to Calder Brook was buried under 3 feet of packed snow, and the nearest doctor might as well have been in another country. She had prepared the box. She had assessed the dresser drawer. She had organized the cabin in the particular way of a woman who is arranging things so they can be found in the dark by someone who is frightened and working alone. One evening I came in from helping my father and found her sitting at the table in the lamplight with a sheet of paper before her writing. I could see it was a letter from the careful way she formed the words, not her usual quick script, but deliberate, each sentence considered. I did not ask who it was to. Some things a 9-year-old understands to leave unasked. Later, when I was in my corner pretending to sleep, I heard her fold the paper and place it in the wooden box beside the bed. Not sealed, just folded and placed as if she wanted it accessible without wanting to think too carefully about why accessibility mattered. I lay in my corner and listened to the fire and thought about what it meant to prepare for something you hoped would not happen, and I thought about my father outside in the cold, checking the spacing of trees in the dark, and I understood for the first time that they were doing the same thing. Both of them, preparing with everything they had for the version of events that went wrong, so that if it did, they would not face it empty-handed. The thought was not comforting exactly, but it was solid. It had the quality of something you can stand on. The last week of November came in on a quality of air that the oldest settlers had a name for. It did not announce itself with drama. It announced itself with absence. The wind dropped not gradually, but in stages like a fire being turned down, and then it was simply gone. Not weakened. Gone. The basin, which had been moving air continuously since September, went still in a way that felt less like calm and more like suspension. Like something pausing between one thing and the next, gathering itself. The sky went flat. Not grey, not cloudy in the conventional sense, but uniformly pale, the color of a spent cartridge flat. And without depth, a sky that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. There was no texture to it, no variation, no suggestion of movement. My father felt the change before he could have named it. He was out before first light, moving through the rings with his lantern, not checking systematically that work was done. This was the way you go through a house before you leave it touching the lock on the door and the latch on the window, not because you've forgotten whether you secured them, but because you need to feel the confirmation in your hands. He walked each ring 3 times. He stood at the north side of the outer ring for a long time, and looked toward the ridge that defined the northern edge of the basin. Nothing was moving up there. Nothing visible. But the absence of movement in a place that had been moving wind since September without pause was itself a thing to read. He came inside and ate breakfast without saying much. He drank his coffee and looked through the window at the flat, pale sky. My mother moved around the kitchen behind him. I watched them both and said nothing. After a while, she sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table between them. She looked at his face. She said, "What if the wind changes?" It was the same question she had asked before weeks ago, and they both knew it. But she was not asking the same question. Before she had been asking about his design. Now she was asking something that didn't have a technical answer. What if everything you've done is not enough? What if the storm that's coming asks more than you've designed against? What then? My father looked at her hands on the table. He looked at her face. Outside, the still basin held its breath. He did not answer. That was the first time all autumn that he didn't have one. And the silence where the answer should have been was in its own way more honest than anything he had said before. It acknowledged without words that there is a point in any undertaking where preparation ends and reality begins, where you have done everything you are capable of doing and the rest is not up to you. My mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the small, precise nod of a woman who asked a question, knowing she might not get the answer she hoped for, and decided to ask it anyway, because asking honestly is better than the silence of not asking. She got up and went back to what she had been doing. My father finished his coffee. He stood. He put on his coat. He went back outside. He was at the drift lanes, the pressure release points in the cedar ring, the designed exits through which the storm could bleed its force when the light changed. It was not the light of clouds moving in. It happened all at once, without transition. One moment, the basin sat in that flat, pale suspension. The next moment, the northern ridge had vanished. Not behind clouds. Behind a wall of white, a solid, moving, opaque mass of wind-driven snow advancing across the basin floor at a speed that eliminated the possibility of considered response. It crossed the distance from the ridge to the outer ring of trees in the time it took to register what it was. The sound arrived half a second after the war, a roar that was continuous and total, replacing all other sounds completely. The cedar ring took the first impact and the sound changed. Not quieter, but different. Broken, fragmented. The roar dissolving into something more complicated as the wind drove through the trees and lost the shape that had been making it a single coherent force. My father had one hand on a cedar trunk and the other extended into the dead air basin, and he could feel the difference between the two sides of that ring with both hands simultaneously at the moment of impact. On the outer side, where his hand gripped the cedar, the bark vibrated under the wind load. On the inner side, where his other hand hung in the space between the rings and the cabin, the air moved strangely, present, turbulent in small, irregular ways, but not carrying the weight of what was happening 4 feet away on the other side of the cedar line. He stood like that for a moment. Both hands, the difference between them. Then the cabin door flew open and Cobb was in the doorway, his voice barely audible through the roar. "PA, Emma needs you now." My father pulled his hand from the cedar trunk. He looked once at the drift beginning to form beyond the outer ring, forming there, not here exactly where the design intended. and he looked at the way the snow moved through the cedar branches, losing itself, spending its carrying energy in the trees and arriving in the dead air, basin in small, fragmentary gusts that fell almost straight down. The design was holding. He turned and ran toward the light in the cabin doorway. The roar did not diminish when he crossed the threshold. It followed him, and not the full force of it, not the wall of white that was moving across the basin floor outside, but the sound of it, the continuous, total sound that had replaced the world. The cabin walls absorbed some of it and transformed the rest into a deep, sustained vibration that you felt in your back teeth and in the soles of your feet and in the way the lantern flame bent slightly even though the door was closed and the shutters were latched. Netta was at the edge of the bed. She was not lying down. She was sitting upright with both hands gripping the wooden frame, her knuckles pale, her face carrying the concentrated inward expression of a woman whose body has taken over the management of a situation and is no longer accepting input from the mind. She looked at Reuben when he came through the door, and what passed across her face was not fear and not relief, but something more precise than either the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just been joined by someone whose presence changes the weight of it without changing the fact of it. She said, "It's time." 2 words. She had spent the autumn in careful understatement, carrying her fears in silence, preparing her small wooden box without announcement, asking her one question about wind, and then nodding and going back to work. 2 words was consistent with everything she had been all season. It was enough. Reuben crossed to her in 3 steps. He put one hand over hers, bed frame. He looked at her face and read what was in it, the way he read terrain, not looking for what he hoped to find, but for what was actually there. Then he looked at me. I was standing in the corner by the stove where I had been since I heard my mother call. I was 9 years old, and I had some general understanding of what was happening, and I was frightened in a way that was different from the fear I had felt about the storm. The storm was large and impersonal and outside. This was small and specific, and here, my father's voice was calm. Not performing calm for my benefit, genuinely calm in the way that certain people become most themselves, precisely when the situation is most serious. He said, "Cobb, the box beside the bed." I got the box. He said, "Put 2 more logs on the fire, then stay there. Don't let it drop." I put the logs on. I stayed at the stove. What followed was 3 days that existed outside of ordinary time. Not because extraordinary things happened every moment. Most of it was waiting, tending the slow management of a situation that could not be hurried and could not be escaped. But because the storm pressed so completely against the edges of the cabin that the outside world ceased to have any practical reality. There was no basin. There was no briar hollow. There were 4 walls and a stove and a lantern and the 3 of us and whatever was coming. My father worked from the medical book he had purchased at a pharmacy in Bismarck in the spring of 1877, a thin volume with a cracked spine and small print bought on a May afternoon when the idea of needing it had felt responsible and abstract rather than immediate and necessary. He had read it twice when he bought it and not since. Now he read the relevant sections by lantern light multiple times, with the same focused attention he gave everything. He asked my mother questions when he needed to, and she answered them between the long, slow waves of pain that came and went and came again, with increasing frequency and decreasing space between them. She did not cry out. I want to say that clearly because it is part of who she was. She braced herself against the bed frame and breathed through what the body asked of her and answered my father's questions in a steady voice when the questions came, and she did not cry out. The sound she made was not a sound of defeat, but of effort, the particular sound of a person doing the hardest work they have ever done, and doing it without flinching. I kept the fire. It is a small thing to say, and it was a large thing to do across 3 days and 3 nights. I kept it because it was what I had been told to do, and because doing it gave me somewhere to put the fear, somewhere useful and specific a task with clear requirements and clear evidence of success. The logs went in, and the fire burned, and the cabin stayed warm, and that was something. That was a thing I could do when there was very little else that I could do. The first night was the longest. At some point deep in it, I noticed something. I noticed it gradually. The way you notice something that has always been true, but that you have not formulated into conscious observation until the moment you do. The cabin was warm. Not comfortably warm, this was still frontier winter, but warmer than it should have been, warmer than our firewood consumption explained. Warmer, specifically, than the previous winter had been at comparable temperatures when we had burned wood at a rate that always felt slightly faster than we could afford. The logs were lasting longer. The fire required less maintenance than it should have. The frost that usually crept along the base of the window glass was confined to the corners rather than spreading across the full width of the pane. I understood what this meant before I could have articulated it. The snow was building up outside the cedar ring, stacking against the outer ring and rising along the outer side of the dead air basin, and as it built, it was doing something that deep snow does when it accumulates undisturbed. It was becoming insulation. Dense and packed, settling into the irregular spaces between the cedar trunks and the pine trunks and the frozen ground, insulating the interior of the ring system the way a deep snowpack insulates the earth beneath it. The storm was building the walls, not the walls of the cabin, those had been there since 1877. The walls around the cabin. The walls that Reuben Voss had spent 3 months trying to teach the storm to build. And the storm, indifferent to intention and entirely without awareness of what it was doing, was building them exactly where he had designed them to be built, because the rings of trees had given the wind nowhere else to put what it was carrying. I sat beside the stove in the deep middle of that first night and understood this, and something settled in my chest that had been unsettled since September. My father had not been wrong. He had not been the tree man, the fool on the flats, the man who gambled his family's survival on a crazy idea. He had been the man who read the storm before it arrived and prepared the place for it to spend itself. The storm was doing exactly what he had asked it to do. The child came on the second day. I will not reconstruct in detail the hours that preceded it because they belong to my mother and my father in a way that observation alone cannot claim. What I will say is this: my father did not falter. He worked from the book and from whatever reserves of steadiness existed inside him, and he was fully present in the way the moment required, and when it was over, he sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. For a long moment that I understood was not collapse but release, the letting go of something he had held so tightly and for so long that setting it down required its own effort. Then he lifted his face. And he was holding my sister. She was very small and very new, and she was making a sound that cut straight through the continuous roar of the storm outside, thin and precise and entirely alive, the sound of a new person announcing her existence to a world that was currently engaged in trying to bury us all in 12 feet of packed snow. It was the most alive sound I had ever heard. I was still at the stove. I had not moved from it in hours. I looked at my father holding her, and I did not move for a moment because the sight of it required a moment to absorb this man who had spent 3 months measuring circles in frozen ground, who had worked until his hands bled, who had stood in a blizzard reading the drift lines one last time before running back through the door, now sitting on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, holding something that weighed almost nothing and meant everything. My mother's voice came from the pillow, exhausted and clear. "What do we name her?" My father looked at the window. Snow dark opaque with the storm pressed against it, the outside world reduced to white noise and white chaos. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked back down at his daughter. "Cedar," he said. "Her name is Cedar." I was 9 years old at the stove in the 3rd day of a Dakota blizzard, and when I heard that name, I felt something move through me that I did not have words for then, and that I am still not certain I have adequate words for now. It was not just that the name was right, though it was right in the way that certain things are right completely without remainder, fitting the moment so exactly that any alternative was simply unimaginable. It was that the name meant he had done this for her, all of it. The measuring rope and the freezing mornings and the midnight hours with the lantern and the bleeding hands, all of it had been in some sense that went beyond the practical for the person who was now in his hands. For the life that was going to need this cabin standing in the spring. I looked at my sister being held by my father in the lamplight with the storm raging outside and touching none of us. And I put another log on the fire, and sometime after that, with cedar making small sounds in the drawer my father had lined with blankets and placed beside the bed, with Netta's breathing settling into the rhythm of a deep, exhausted sleep, I sat down beside the stove and closed my eyes and slept. The storm did not end on the third day. It ended on the fourth morning between midnight and first light, the way major things sometimes end, not with drama or announcement, but with a simple cessation, stopping the wind going quiet between one moment and the next, as if it had finished what it came to do and had no reason to continue. I woke to silence, not the silence of a held breath, not the suspension that had preceded the storm's arrival. A different silence, a finished silence, the silence of a thing that has run its full course and departed. My father was already awake. I could tell from the way he was sitting at the table, not the posture of someone recently roused, but the upright stillness of someone who has been awake long enough to trust the silence. My mother was sleeping. Cedar was sleeping in the drawer beside the bed, wrapped in the blanket that had been stored there through the summer and fall, waiting without knowing it was waiting. My father looked at the door. I looked at the door. He stood. He crossed to it. He put his hand on the wooden bar that held it shut, and stood there with his palm against the wood for a moment, feeling through it whatever there was to feel. Then he lifted the bar. The door opened inward, and cold air moved softly into the cabin. Not the violent intrusion of the storm, not the cutting blast of driven snow, but a gentle, settled cold, the ordinary cold of a Dakota morning after weather clean and quiet and bearing no malice. My father stepped outside. I was behind him close enough to see past his shoulder, and what I saw stopped both of us in the same moment. The world had changed. Beyond the outer pine ring rising on all sides of the homestead in a great curving wall was the snow. It was enormous. It was architectural. In its proportions, a curved rampart of packed and settled drift that rose to within a few feet of the cabin's roofline at its highest point on the north side, tapering around to the east and west in long sloping shoulders that enclosed the homestead, the way cupped hands enclose something small and valuable. The tops of the outer pine trees were barely visible above the drift wall, dark green points jutting from the white, like the tips of buried fence posts, the only evidence that there was structure beneath the surface of what the storm had built. Inside the drift wall, inside the rings, the ground was different in a way that took a moment to fully register. It was not bare. There was snow on the ground within the rings, a settled shallow layer of soft powder, perhaps 3 inches in the deepest places. 3 inches where 3 feet or 5 feet lay against everything outside the rings. 3 inches through which the packed earth was faintly visible as a darker tone beneath the white. 3 inches through which the path between the cabin door and the woodpile was still traceable, the path between the woodpile and the goat shed still intact beneath a covering so shallow that a boot pressed through it without effort. The goat shed was standing. The woodpile was buried under powder. The cabin walls were clear. The door had opened without having to be dug out. The chimney rose from the roof unobstructed, and the smoke coming from it went straight up, not sideways, not bent and shredded by crosswind. Straight up into a pale gray sky from which the storm had completely departed, rising in a thin column that went up and up without deflecting perfectly, vertical, a small flag of the ordinary, planted in the silence of the morning. My father stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. I stood behind him and looked at it with him. After a long time, I stepped out beside him into the shallow powder. "Did we win, Pa?" My father looked at the drift wall. He looked at the powder-dusted ground between the rings. He looked at the smoke going straight up. "No," he said. "The storm did the work. We just told it where to go." He said it quietly, without drama, the way he said everything that mattered to him. He said it in the tone of a man who has spent 8 years thinking about something and has just seen it confirmed in the largest and most complete way possible, and who finds that confirmation less like triumph and more like the settling of a long-held breath. We stood there together in the cold morning, father and son, inside the shelter the storm had built around us. Harlan Creed arrived on horseback on the second morning after the storm. He came from the east, from the direction of Calderbrook, and he came with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for a specific thing and is not certain his preparation was adequate. He had been thinking about the Voss claim since the storm began. He had been thinking about it the way you think about something you cannot do anything about, returning to it in the intervals between tasks, running the numbers in his head, assessing the probabilities. He had been preparing, if he was honest with himself, for what he would need to do when he found what he expected to find. Who would need to be notified? What would need to be done about the boy? He crested the last rise on the basin road and pulled his horse to a stop. Smoke, rising straight from the cabin chimney, thin and grey and perfectly vertical in the still morning air. He sat on his horse and looked at it for a moment. Below, inside the strange ring of snow surrounding the cabin, the enormous curved drift wall that enclosed the homestead like a fortification, he could see movement. A small figure in the shallow powder. The sound of boots on light snow carried in the cold air all the way to the road where he sat. Netta Voss was on the porch with something wrapped in a blanket against her chest, standing in the cold morning, with the careful stillness of a woman who has recently been through something large and is allowing herself cautiously to believe that the large thing is over. And Reuben Voss was at the goat shed shoveling the narrow path between the shed door and the woodpile with the same steady, unhurried rhythm he had moved with all autumn. Harlan Creed dismounted. He did not tie the horse. He let the reins hang and walked forward through the outer drift wall where the snow had settled lower along the eastern edge chest-high there, rather than roof-high, and crossed into the ring. He felt it when he crossed the line. The air changed. He had ridden 2 miles of open basin to get here, and the difference was not subtle. Inside the rings, the air was still. The wind was present in the basin. He could hear it moving across the open ground to the north and east, the storm's trailing edge dragging across the plain. But here, inside the drift wall, and the cedar ring, and the dead air basin that Reuben Voss had spent 3 months building, the air hung without direction. Creed stopped walking. He stood inside the ring and listened to his own boots in the powder. He could hear the creak of the porch rope. He could hear faintly from inside the cabin the sound of something new, a small high sound that had not been in this basin before 3 days ago. He stood there for a long time. Reuben Voss had set down his shovel and come to stand 10 feet away. He did not rush toward the moment or present himself. He just stood in his canvas coat in the cold morning light inside the quiet he had built and waited. Harlan Creed looked at the drift wall surrounding them. He looked at the cedar tops visible above the snow line, the pine tips jutting from the outer crest. He looked at the shallow powder on the ground, the clear paths, the standing shed, the straight smoke. He looked at all of this with the thorough, honest attention of a man who has lived long enough on hard ground to know that the country does not reward stubbornness, and that the willingness to look at a thing and change your understanding of it is not weakness, but the only form of intelligence that actually keeps you alive out here. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Reuben Voss. "You didn't stop the storm," he said. His voice was quiet, not soft. Harlan Creed had not had a soft voice in 40 years, but quiet in the way that carries further than loud. His gaze moved upward to the towering drift wall that enclosed them, the thing the storm had constructed in the place Reuben had designed for it to construct something. "You taught it where to break." Reuben said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides in the cold morning air, and let those words exist in the space between them without deflecting them or amplifying them or adding to them in any way. He had spent the autumn being told in various registers and with varying degrees of kindness what he was doing wrong. He had spent 3 days in a blizzard, delivering his own daughter and keeping his family warm on less firewood than any previous winter had required. He had stepped outside this morning into the proof of everything he had spent 8 years thinking about. He did not need to say anything, and Harlan Creed, who had spent his whole adult life in country that did not reward unnecessary speech, understood that. The 2 men stood inside the shelter of the storm's own making in the still air of the dead basin, and the understanding between them was as complete as it needed to be. After a while, Creed looked toward the porch where Netta stood with the wrapped bundle against her chest. "Boy or girl?" he said. Girl, my father said. We named her Cedar. Creed looked at the cedar ring. He looked at the child. Then he nodded once, the small, precise nod of a man filing away a fact he intends to keep, and went to get his horse. Solomon Cade came in the first week of December, when the basin trails had opened enough for travel. He came from the north, the way he always came, and he walked the rings the way he walked. Everything slowly stopping at intervals, to crouch at drift deposits, pressing his gloved hand through the cedar branches at various points, to feel the air on the sheltered side, examining the shape of what the storm had left behind, with the unhurried attention of a man who has spent his life reading the evidence the country leaves of itself. He spent the better part of an hour in quiet examination. Then he came inside, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the schematic. The same survey paper covered in my father's corrections and notations, drift lanes marked in red ring positions, adjusted and readjusted across 3 months of thinking and failing and thinking again. Cedar was sleeping in the drawer. My mother was resting. I sat in my corner and watched the old trapper look at the drawing. How many families you figure to show this to? Cade said. My father said as many as want to know. Cade looked at the schematic another moment. He looked at the window at the basin visible through the glass, the drift walls still standing at the cedar line, the shallow powder between the rings, the smoke from the chimney cutting straight up into the cold December sky. Folks will be calling these Voss rings, he said, before the next snow. He said it with the flat certainty of a man making an observation, not a prediction. The way he said everything, he was right. Spring came to Briar Hollow Basin the way it always came to Dakota Territory, not as a reversal, but as a gradual renegotiation. The cold releasing its grip degree by degree, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, then the open ground, then the shaded hollows. Meltwater carved dark channels through the drift wall, and the drift wall shrank and settled, and finally flattened into the basin floor, leaving behind a tracery of bent grass that showed exactly where it had stood. The rings of trees remained. They were taller now than when they had been planted, not dramatically taller, but measurably, so their roots pressed deeper into the prairie soil, their trunks having been tested in the particular way that only a genuine proving winter can test a thing. They had bent in the storm. Some of them had bent considerably. None had broken. The root systems that Reuben had taken such care with the wide root bowls, the soaked canvas, the careful packing of frozen dirt had held. Harlan Creed was the first to come with questions. He came on a Thursday in late March, the mud deep enough to make the ride from his place unpleasant but not impassable. He tied his horse at the fence post and walked across the yard carrying a length of measuring tape in his rough, weathered hand. He found my father at the outer pine ring, where the last of the drift wall had finished settling and revealed the ground beneath. How far apart did you set these? Creed said. Not how does it work? Not what made you think of it. Just the immediate, practical question. The question of a man who has decided he wants to know what he needs to know to build the same thing. My father answered him fully, without reservation. He walked Creed through the ring system from the outer pine line inward, explaining the spacing and the reasoning for it, showing where the drift lanes were positioned and why they angled the way they did. Demonstrating with a handful of loose powder how the air moved through the cedar ring differently than it moved through the pine ring. He showed him how to read drift deposits to understand wind behavior, how the shape and density of a drift told you everything about the current that made it, how you could work backward from the evidence the snow left to understand the force that had driven it. Creed listened. He measured. He wrote figures into the small notebook he had brought, pressing the pencil into the pages with the deliberate force of a man writing things he intends to keep. He did not apologize for the autumn. Harlan Creed was not a man who managed apologies with any fluency, and my father understood this and did not wait for one. What Creed offered instead was his full serious attention, given without reservation to a thing he had spent the autumn dismissing, and this was in its own way more valuable than any apology, because it was less about the past and more about what came next. Other homesteaders came after him. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the strange arrangement of trees that had survived the worst blizzard in recent memory without burying its occupants. Some came because they had lost portions of roofs or buried wagons or frozen livestock in the same storm and had been thinking since then about whether there was a better way. A few came because they had children, and the children's safety had a way of making a man re-examine his certainties. They all got the same thing. My father walked them through it. He showed them the pine ring and the cedar ring and the dead air basin. He showed them how to read drift deposits, to understand wind behavior. He pointed at the drift lanes and explained that they were not weaknesses, but exits, designed paths for pressure that would otherwise build until it found its own way through the wrong place. He never made it a lecture. He walked and showed and answered questions and let the system explain itself where it could. I followed behind with the measuring rope the way I had followed all autumn and watched the homesteaders write in their notebooks and on the backs of wagon boards and on whatever they had brought or could find to write on. One afternoon, Solomon Cade came and sat on the fence post to watch. He sat there with his arms folded on his chest and his hat pulled against the thin spring sun, watching a family from the north edge of the basin copying ring measurements into a ledger. He watched with the expression of a man seeing something arrive that he had been expecting for a while. After a time, he said, "Voss rings to no one in particular." The name was already moving through basin conversations. You heard it at the feed supply in Calderbrook. You heard it at the Saturday gathering outside the blacksmith shop. You heard it in the way names move on the frontier, not by proclamation, but by repetition, by the gradual consensus of people who need a name for something that exists and have decided this is the right one. Voss rings. It sounded like what it was. Cedar grew up playing beneath trees that had once fit in a man's hand. I watch her in memory, running between the cedar trunks in the still air of the dead basin, her small boots on the powdered ground, not knowing or caring about the physics of what surrounded her. Understanding only that this was her place and it was different here than everywhere else she had been. The wind was different, the air was different, the sound was different. She grew up knowing this the way she knew the shape of the northern ridge against the winter sky as the simple ordinary fact of where she lived. My father never called himself smart. I heard him say this more than once in the years that followed when people came to ask about the rings with the admiring curiosity that makes most men want to take credit. He always gave the same answer. He called himself patient. He said the difference between smart and patient was that smart was about what you knew and patient was about how long you were willing to look at something before you decided you understood it. He said the winter was the best teacher he ever had. He said it was hard and honest, and completely without interest in his feelings about what it was showing him, which made it better than most teachers. The cabin stood in Briar Hollow Basin for more than 40 years after the winter of 1879. The rings grew with the passing seasons, the lodgepole pine rising taller, each year thickening at the trunk, their roots driving deeper into the Dakota soil. The cedar ring filled in the branches, interweaving the gaps that had been measured so precisely, becoming passages through a living wall that was no longer made of saplings, but of trees. The basin between the rings stayed calm through storms that buried the open country around it. The drift wall rebuilt itself every winter in the same places, shaped by the same logic, the wind leaving its deposit where the rings told it to leave it. The storms never stopped coming. They came every winter the way they had always come to Dakota territory, with the same cold and the same force and the same indifference to the arrangements of small human lives on the open plain. But around the Voss homestead, the wind moved differently. Travelers on the Basin Road noticed it in winter when the storm was visible in the country around the claim, but the cabin stood inside its ring of trees with its smoke going straight up, surrounded by the wall the storm had built for it. Some called it luck. Some called it frontier wisdom. Some came to see it and left without a name for it, carrying something in their minds that they could not quite articulate, but that changed in some small way how they thought about the relationship between a man and the country he lived in. The people who understood the full story, who had been there that September, watching a man measure circles in hardening earth while his neighbors stacked firewood and shook their heads, or who had ridden through the basin the morning after the blizzard and crossed the line where the wind disappeared. Those people called it neither luck nor wisdom. They called it patience and attention. and the willingness to stand in the cold long enough for the storm to tell you what it knew, and to listen carefully enough to use what it said. My father's name was Reuben Voss. He was 38 years old in the winter of 1879. He was not the kind of man whose presence announced itself before he spoke. He carried no authority that anyone could see. He came to Briar Hollow Basin with a piece of torn notebook paper and 8 years of thinking and a willingness to do the work that the thinking required, and he built his family's shelter out of those 3 things and nothing else. Cedar grew up in it. She grew up in the shelter her father designed, and the storm built under trees that had once been small enough to carry in both arms in the quiet basin of still air that a Dakota blizzard constructed around her on the night she was born. My name is Cobb Voss. I was 9 years old that winter. I kept the fire, and I have been keeping it in one form or another ever since. Not because I was asked to, but because I understood on that long 4th night with the storm pressing against the cedar ring and my sister breathing in the drawer beside the bed, and my father's book open on the table, that keeping the fire is not a small thing. It is sometimes the only thing that needs doing. And doing it well through the whole of a long, dark night is its own kind of patience. And in the end, the same storm that might have buried us became the thing that built our walls instead.